Hi, today I will be talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, what was the Cuban Missile Crisis? The Cuban Missile Crisis was a confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War that nearly led to nuclear conflict that would have impacted the whole world. It was the closest any two parties ever came to starting a nuclear war. When did the Cuban Missile Crisis occur? The Cuban Missile Crisis lasted for about 13 days. It started on October 16, 1962 and ended on October 28, 1962. What started or caused the Cuban Missile Crisis? The Cuban Missile Crisis was an aftermath of the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Bay of Pigs invasion happened a year prior and caused a distrust between Cuba and the U.S. To sum it up, the Bay of Pigs invasion was when the U.S. tried to overthrow Fidel Castro but failed. Then Cuba resided to the USSR, who then transported missiles to Cuba, and this caused tension between the US and the USSR. The missiles were aimed straight for the US, so in return the US aimed the missiles they had stationed in Europe to the Soviet Union. The missiles that were stationed in Cuba was there to give Cuba some safety and protection just in case the US tried to invade Cuba once again. Prevention attempts. The US tried to block shipments from the USSR to Cuba on October 22nd to quarantine Cuba. Then President Kennedy wrote a letter to Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev demanding that there be no more missiles sent to Cuba and that the missile bases that were already in Cuba needed to be dismantled. On October 24th, Khrushchev communicated back and said that the US's blockade was an act of aggression and that shipments will still proceed. October 24th to 25th. Ships continued to come into Cuba's waters despite the U.S.'s quarantine. Some were stopped by U.S. naval forces but contained no weapons and were allowed to pass by. U.S. reconnaissance flights over Cuba showed that the missile launch sites were almost ready for operation. The U.S. moved to DEFCON 2 as it seemed as though the nuclear war will commence. This is the only time in history where the U.S. moved to DEFCON 2, and the DEFCON system is a ranking of the level of severity or the level of alertness that the U.S. Army is about to commence into war, and in DEFCON 5 that is the lowest, and that shows that there is peace and everything is normal and under control. DEFCON 1 is critical, meaning that we are at war, nuclear war will happen, and that has never been activated. Like I said, DEFCON 2 is the highest that we've ever moved up to, and only in the Cuban Missile Crisis. October 26th to 27th. On October 26th, Kennedy starts to speculate that the only way for the missiles to be moved from Cuba is by a U.S. attack. Later that day, Khrushchev sent a letter to Kennedy proposing that a resolution is better than starting a war. On the 27th, Khrushchev sends another letter that to reach a resolution, the U.S. needs to dismantle the missiles in Turkey that were aimed at the USSR. Like I mentioned before, the U.S. aimed all the missiles that were stationed in Europe to the Soviet Union as a way to protect themselves from the missiles in Cuba that were aimed at them. Kennedy ignored the second letter but sent another letter back regarding to Khrushchev's first message. Spy plane. On October 27th, a spy plane piloted by Major Rudolf Anderson was spotted and shot down by a Soviet missile. He was the only life lost due to the opposing party's fire in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this letter is a copy of President Kennedy's letter to Major Rudolf Anderson's wife regarding his death. B-59 submarine. Later that day, a U.S. Navy vessel hit a nuclear-armed Soviet submarine with a depth charge or a depth bomb to try to signal for it to come up. The commanders of the submarine mistook this as a signal that the nuclear war had started and nearly launched a nuclear torpedo. 3 officers had to unanimously approve of this, but only 2 out of the 3 agreed to launch. Vasily Arkhipov was the officer who disapproved of the launch, and this action essentially saved the world. The deal. After the letter Kennedy sent back to Khrushchev, the Attorney General then met with the Soviet ambassador of the United States to privately discuss the dismantling of missiles and the promise to not attack Cuba. They reached a resolution. On October 28th, Khrushchev announced publicly that the missiles would be removed from Cuba. The crisis was officially over. Aftermath. The Cuban Missile Crisis was an eye-opener for both the U.S. and the USSR. It was the closest the world has ever been to a nuclear war, and all due to many reasons that could have been prevented with more communication on both sides. In 1963, a hotline was installed in Washington, D.C. and Moscow so that another crisis would not happen again in the future and would be diffused a lot quicker. However, the Cold War does not officially end for another 29 years. The end. Thank you for listening.